Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're looking at something
Uh-huh.
pretty interesting,
Yeah.
I think. We're
Mhm.
going to be kind of wading into the waters of human interaction,
All right.
specifically how we size up strangers.
Interesting.
Like when you meet someone for the first time,
Yeah.
what are those things that
Yeah.
your brain is
Yeah.
doing to try and figure out, are they friend or foe?
Yeah.
Can I trust them? Should I be wary?
hmm
And why are we so bad at spotting a liar?
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that we find is that our brains are kind of wired
Yeah.
to believe what we're told,
True.
even when there's a chance we're being misled.
Hmm.
Researchers call this defaulting to truth.
Defaulting to truth.
Yes. And it's way more common than you might think.
Okay, so break that down for me, defaulting to truth.
Sure.
Like, are we talking about just assuming everyone's telling the truth?
Well, not necessarily all the time.
Okay.
But think of it as our starting point. We take information at face value until we have a solid reason to doubt it.
Okay.
I mean, imagine if you questioned every single thing anyone told you.
Yeah, that would be
You would never get anything done.
exhausting and I think a little maddening.
It really would.
But doesn't that leave us super open to being manipulated?
It does.
Yeah.
And there's a great example of this in the case of Anna Montez.
Okay.
She worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency,
Oh, wow.
was well respected,
Yeah.
and nobody suspected she was a Cuban spy for almost 2 decades.
Wait, so people worked with her every day,
Yeah.
trusted her with
Yeah.
really sensitive information,
Yeah.
and had no clue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it really illustrates this power of default to truth.
Yeah.
Because even when they were presented with evidence
Hmm.
that maybe she was being duplicitous,
Yeah.
people really struggled
To accept it.
to accept it.
Wow. So that's both fascinating and a little scary.
It is.
I mean, it makes you wonder how many times we've been totally taken in by someone and
Right.
had no idea.
It happens more often than we'd like to admit. But, this default to truth, it's
Yeah.
usually actually beneficial. Okay,
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine a world where suspicion was the norm?
Right. That would be
Social interactions would be so difficult.
very difficult.
Yeah.
So if most of us are kind of hardwired to trust,
Mm-hmm.
are we just doomed to be fooled? Or are there ways to get better at?
Well, there are some people who seem to be naturally more skeptical.
Okay.
We could call them the holy fools.
Holy fools.
Yeah. Like whistleblower skeptics, anyone who just instinctively questions the status quo.
Okay, so these are the folks who are not
Right.
just accepting things at face value.
Exactly.
They're always kind of poking around looking for the truth, even when it's uncomfortable.
Precisely.
Interesting.
And while their constant questioning can be annoying sometimes,
Yeah, I bet.
they often play a really crucial role
Yeah.
in uncovering hidden truths. Like Harry Markopolos
Okay.
spent years trying to expose Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme,
Right, and of course,
faced ridicule and disbelief.
but he was right.
He was absolutely right.
Yeah.
And it was one of the biggest financial frauds in history.
So are these holy fools like walking lie detectors or something?
Well, they're not infallible, of course.
Right.
But they are often more attuned to inconsistencies
Right.
and less likely to be swayed by charm or charisma.
Okay.
So think of them as having a higher BS meter
Higher BS meter. I like that.
than the average person.
I can definitely think of a few people like that.
Right.
So we've got these holy fools on one end of the spectrum,
Uh-huh.
and then the rest of us who are more inclined to trust.
Yeah.
Is there like a happy medium somewhere in between?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do we balance
Right?
a healthy dose of skepticism
Yeah.
without becoming overly suspicious and cynical?
Right.
It's a tricky tightrope walk.
It is.
Yeah.
Speaking of being fooled,
Mm.
there's this whole idea that we can read people's emotions
Yes.
through their facial expressions.
Uh-huh.
Is there any truth to that, or is that just wishful thinking?
Yeah, that's the myth of transparency.
Transparency. So
Yeah.
you're telling me those poker faces actually work?
It's more complicated than that.
Great.
We like to believe that our faces are open books,
Right.
revealing our true feelings, but research suggests it's way more complicated than that.
Okay, so there's not like a universal language.
Well, let's take a study, for example, that was done in the Trobriand Islands.
Okay.
Okay, so researchers show the islanders
Ah.
photographs of facial expressions
Okay.
that we in Western cultures associate with specific emotions.
Yeah.
What they found was really surprising.
What'd they find?
Well, while there was some agreement,
Yeah.
the islanders interpreted a lot of the expressions
Uh-huh.
differently than we would.
Really?
For instance, what we typically see as a fear face
Yeah.
was often perceived as a sign of threat by the Trobrianders.
Huh. So it's not as universal as we might think.
Exactly. It highlights the limitations
Yeah.
of relying solely on those facial cues
Ah,
to understand someone's true emotions or intentions.
right. Especially when you're dealing with people from different cultures
Exactly.
and backgrounds.
Yes.
That's super insightful.
It is.
It makes you realize how easy it is to misinterpret
Right.
someone's expressions
Yeah.
and make judgments based on totally faulty assumptions.
Absolutely. And those misinterpretations can have
Yeah.
significant consequences,
Yeah.
particularly in contexts like the legal system,
Oh, interesting.
where judges often rely on facial cues
Uh-huh.
to assess credibility or guilt.
I remember reading about how unreliable eyewitness testimony can be,
Right.
and now I'm starting to see how our perception of facial expressions
Exactly.
can make it that much more complicated.
Absolutely. It underscores the need to be cautious
Yeah.
about jumping to conclusions
Right.
based solely on someone's outward appearance.
So if we can't always trust our gut,
Right.
and we can't always rely on facial expressions,
Mm-hmm.
are there any reliable tools for navigating these tricky interactions with strangers?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Especially when you
Yeah.
consider things like alcohol, which can really cloud judgment.
Ah, yes, alcohol. That's a whole other layer of complexity
Oh, yeah,
when it comes to talking to strangers.
for sure.
Alcohol famously lowers inhibitions
Uh-huh.
and can lead us to make decisions
Oh, seen it
that we wouldn't normally make.
so many times.
Right.
Where it's like,
Dude.
oh, liquid courage, and suddenly you're like
Exactly.
the most talkative person in the room or
That's right.
doing things that are totally out of character.
Exactly. Alcohol induces a state of myopia.
Myopia.
Basically, it narrows our focus to immediate rewards
Uh-huh.
and suppresses our ability to think critically
Okay.
about the long-term consequences.
So we're not
Wow.
really thinking about the risks.
We're not.
We're not seeing the bigger picture.
No.
We're just kind of in the moment.
Exactly.
And that can lead to some
All sorts of risky behavior.
risky behavior for sure.
Especially when interacting with strangers,
Okay.
we become more impulsive,
Yeah.
less aware of social cues,
Uh-huh.
more likely to misinterpret signals.
And then there's the whole blackout thing,
Oh, yeah.
which is terrifying.
Blackouts are particularly concerning
Yeah.
because you can appear to be functioning normally. You
Okay.
can be having conversations, making decisions,
Uh-huh.
but later you have absolutely no memory
It's like a total blank.
of those events.
Yeah, that is scary.
It's terrifying, and it makes you wonder,
Right.
how can someone truly consent to anything
Right.
if they can't even remember what happened?
It's a really important point.
It is.
And it brings up a lot of questions about consent
Yes,
when alcohol is involved.
absolutely, particularly in situations involving strangers.
Right.
And a really tragic example of this is the case of Brock Turner.
Oh, the Stanford swimmer
Yeah.
who was convicted of sexual assault.
Yes. That case just painfully illustrates the
Yeah.
complexities of alcohol and consent.
Right.
Because both Turner and the victim were heavily intoxicated.
Yeah.
It makes it incredibly difficult
Right.
to determine, the true nature of their interaction
Yeah.
and whether consent was freely and consciously given.
It's a really stark reminder that
Yes.
alcohol can create these situations
Yes.
where consent just becomes
Blurry.
blurry and impossible to really.
And even impossible to assess accurately.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It makes these interactions with strangers that much more challenging,
it does.
especially those environments where alcohol is involved.
Right.
It's like every time we think we have a handle on this whole talking to strangers thing,
Right.
another layer of complexity
Another layer emerges.
emerges.
Yeah.
So what can we do to improve our chances of navigating these interactions successfully?
Well, that's a great question and one we're going to delve into a
Okay.
little more. But before we do that, I want to shift gears a little bit
Okay.
and talk about another factor that can dramatically influence
All right.
our interactions with strangers.
Okay.
And that's the context
Okay.
in which those interactions take place.
Interesting.
Specifically, let's talk about hotspot policing.
Hotspot policing. Okay.
Okay.
I'm intrigued. So hotspot policing
Yeah.
is a law enforcement strategy
Okay.
that focuses on specific areas with high crime rates.
So they're looking at areas where there's a lot of crime
Yes.
and trying to concentrate their efforts there.
Exactly. The idea is that by concentrating police presence in these high crime zones,
Yeah.
they can deter criminal activity
Okay.
and improve overall safety.
So it's like a targeted approach.
It
in
is.
crime prevention.
Exactly.
Right.
However, the reality of hotspot policing is often more complicated,
Right.
and it can sometimes lead to unintended negative consequences,
I could see that.
particularly for people of color. Yeah, because if police are constantly patrolling certain neighborhoods,
Right.
are they more likely to view residents with suspicion?
That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
And one that connects directly to the
Shocking.
tragic story of Sandra Bland.
Sandra Bland, the woman who was found dead
Yes.
in her jail cell
Yes.
after a routine traffic stop.
That's right.
And it all started with a lane change.
It did.
She didn't signal, and that's what led to the traffic stop.
Correct. Officer Brian Encinia pulled her over.
Mm-hmm.
And while the initial reason for the stop was minor,
Right.
the encounter quickly escalated.
Wow.
And Encinia's training and experience in hotspot policing
Right.
may have led him to perceive Bland
Right.
as a potential threat.
Hmm.
And her frustration with the situation
Yeah.
further fueled the tension.
And tragically, it ended with her arrest
And her subsequent
death in police custody.
Yes, it's a stark reminder
Yeah.
of how mistrust, miscommunication, and implicit bias can have devastating consequences.
Right.
Especially in encounters between law enforcement and the public.
That's like, that encounter was a perfect storm of misunderstanding
It really was.
and misinterpretations.
Yes.
You've got Bland's frustration,
Yes.
Encinia's perception of threat, the high-pressure context of a traffic stop in a hotspot policing zone.
Yeah,
It all just collided
it did.
with tragic results.
Yes, and her case raises so many important questions
It does.
about how we train law enforcement officers
Right.
to interact with the public, especially in those high-stakes situations
Right.
where, even seemingly small misunderstandings
Yeah.
can have life-altering consequences.
It's interesting thinking back to the concept of default to truth.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like Encinia in that situation was actually operating from the opposite perspective.
Interesting.
Instead of defaulting to truth, he defaulted to suspicion.
Yeah.
Like he saw her frustration
Yeah.
and immediately jumped to the conclusion that she was hiding something potentially dangerous.
That's a really insightful observation.
Yeah.
And it highlights a critical point
Okay.
about how context can really influence our interactions with strangers.
Yeah.
Because in a hotspot policing environment, officers are often trained to be hypervigilant,
Right.
to see potential threats even in mundane behaviors.
That can create this.
And this can lead to a dangerous cycle
Yeah.
of mistrust and escalation.
Right. As we
saw in Bland's case.
So we've got this default to truth
Right.
that can make us vulnerable to deception.
Yeah.
But then we've got situations like hotspot policing
Exactly.
where defaulting to suspicion
Right.
can lead to these tragic misjudgments.
Yes.
It's like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
It's a real dilemma.
Yeah.
And it really underscores the need for greater awareness
Okay.
and more nuanced approaches
Yeah.
to interacting with strangers, both in our personal lives and in law enforcement.
Right. You know what's really striking about all these cases that we've talked about today?
Yeah.
Is that they all kind of hinge on this fundamental human struggle
They do.
to accurately assess the intentions of others,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's believing a lie,
Right.
misreading a facial expression,
Yeah.
misjudging a stranger's behavior.
Yes.
Our attempts to understand those we don't know
It's true.
are often fraught with error.
They are?
It's like we're constantly trying to decode a language
That's a great analogy.
that we don't fully understand.
I don't really understand.
And it's leading to all these miscommunications and misinterpretations.
It is.
So if we're so bad at talking to strangers,
Right.
why do we even bother?
Well, that's the paradox, isn't it?
It is.
We can't just shut ourselves off from the world.
Right?
We need to engage with strangers, to collaborate, to build relationships, to create a functioning society.
Right.
But we also need to acknowledge our limitations.
Yeah.
Recognize that our attempts to understand those we don't know are inherently imperfect.
It's almost like we need a whole new set of tools
Vague.
for navigating these interactions.
Perhaps.
Something beyond relying on flawed assumptions and unreliable cues.
That's a challenge that researchers and social scientists are grappling with right now.
Interesting.
How do we balance the need for trust
Right.
with a healthy dose of skepticism?
Right.
How do we create systems and practices
Uh-huh.
that minimize the risks
Yeah.
while still allowing for meaningful connections
Right.
with those outside our immediate circles?
It is a lot to think about.
It is.
I bet our listeners are already
I'm sure they are.
pondering these very questions.
I think so.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to consider.
Me too.
It's amazing how something we do every day, talking to strangers, can be so deceptively challenging.
It really is a testament to how nuanced
Yeah.
and multifaceted human behavior is.
Well, on that note, we've reached the end of part 1 of our deep dive into the world of talking to strangers.
All right.
When we come back, we're going to continue exploring this fascinating topic.
Looking forward to it.
So stay tuned.
You know, it's interesting, isn't it?
What's that?
This whole dance of figuring out
Yeah.
who to trust, who to be wary of.
Yeah. And it's not even just about, like, avoiding danger.
Yeah.
Right? It's those everyday interactions.
That's right.
That make up so much of our lives.
Think about it.
Yeah.
Every time you strike up a conversation with someone new, you're kind of taking this leap of faith.
Yeah, you are. Whether it's the barista at your local coffee shop,
right,
or asking someone for directions, or meeting someone at a party.
Yes.
You're constantly making judgments about strangers.
And those judgments are often based on incredibly subtle cues.
Like what kind of cues?
Body language.
Okay.
Tone of voice. Even the way someone dresses. It's amazing how quickly our brains try to categorize people.
Right.
And predict their behavior.
It's like our brains are running these subconscious algorithms.
Exactly.
Trying to calculate the probability that this person is friend or foe.
Is this person trustworthy?
Trustworthy or suspicious?
Should I be approaching?
Should I be approaching?
Or avoiding. Exactly. And while those algorithms can be helpful in some situations, they can also lead to bias.
Of course.
And misjudgments.
Yeah, especially when those are influenced by things like...
Especially when they're influenced by
race,
gender, socioeconomic status.
It's like all those implicit biases we hear so much about that can really color our perceptions without us even realizing it. So how do we break free from these biased algorithms?
Right.
Is it even possible to completely rewire our brains?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It's definitely a work in progress, but there are things we can do.
All right, like what?
Exposure to diverse perspectives. Challenging our own preconceived notions. Consciously seeking out interactions with people outside our usual circles.
So get outside your comfort zone.
Yes. All of these things can help to broaden our understanding. And reduce those biases.
So the more we interact with people from different backgrounds, the more we start to see that our assumptions are often inaccurate.
Often inaccurate and limiting.
Yeah.
You know, it's about recognizing the individuality of each person that we encounter.
Yeah.
Rather than relying on these broad generalizations.
So it's not just about being aware of our biases.
Right.
It's about actively seeking out experiences that challenge those biases.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a mindset of curiosity and openness.
I like that approach strangers with curiosity.
Yes.
It's like turning these everyday encounters into these little mini adventures.
Exactly.
A chance to learn something new and expand our understanding of the world.
And you know those interactions, however brief they may seem or insignificant, they can have this ripple effect, shaping our perceptions and influencing how we engage with others.
Right. It's like every stranger is a potential friend you haven't met yet.
Beautifully said.
And those connections, even fleeting ones, I think can really enrich our lives.
They can.
In ways we don't expect.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about the challenges of talking to strangers.
We have.
The pitfalls of relying on flawed assumptions and biased algorithms. But what about the flip side?
Yeah.
What are the benefits?
That's a great question.
Of engaging with people outside our comfort zones?
Because despite those risks, there's something inherently rewarding about connecting with strangers. I mean, think about the last time you had a meaningful conversation with someone you didn't know. How did it make you feel?
Yeah, like energized.
Inspired.
More connected to the world around you.
Right.
You know, I was thinking about this the other day. I was sitting on a park bench. And I struck up a conversation with this older gentleman. And we just started talking about everything.
Yeah.
From books to the weather.
It's amazing.
And it was such a simple interaction.
Right.
But it totally brightened my day.
Those unexpected encounters can be so powerful.
They can. And they remind us that even though we all come from these different backgrounds and have these different experiences, we all share this common humanity.
Yes, and those shared experiences, those moments of connection can transcend our differences and create a sense of belonging.
Yeah, it's almost like talking to strangers is this way of expanding our own sense of self, of realizing that we're more than just our individual experiences.
Yeah, exactly.
We're part of something much bigger.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of all things.
Yeah, and those connections forged through conversations with strangers can have this ripple effect, spreading outward and creating a more compassionate and understanding world.
I love that.
So even though it can be challenging, even risky, talking to strangers is ultimately a worthwhile endeavor.
I think so.
You know what? Thinking back to our conversation about these holy fools, I'm starting to see them in a new light.
Okay.
Maybe their willingness to question and challenge is actually a form of openness.
Interesting.
Like a way of seeking out new perspectives, expanding their understanding of the world.
That's a fascinating perspective.
It is.
And it highlights how our initial judgments about people can be so misleading. What we might perceive as negativity or cynicism might actually be this deep-seated desire for truth and connection.
So approach every interaction with a sense of curiosity.
Yes.
And be open to the fact that you might learn something unexpected.
Absolutely.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into the world of talking to strangers. What are some key takeaways?
I think the most important thing is to be mindful of our own biases and assumptions. Recognize that our brains are wired to make these snap judgments, but those judgments aren't always accurate.
So challenge those assumptions. Be open to different perspectives and approach every interaction with curiosity.
With a healthy dose of curiosity. And don't be afraid to step outside your comfort zone. You know, strike up conversations with people you wouldn't normally talk to. Ask questions. Listen attentively. And be open to the possibility of making a meaningful connection.
It's like turning these everyday encounters into opportunities for growth and discovery.
That's beautifully said.
And you never know. You might be surprised by the richness.
You might be.
And the depth of those connections that you make.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, we've reached the end of part 2 of our deep dive into the world of talking to strangers.
All right.
You know, it's amazing how much there is to unpack.
I know, right?
When it comes to just this simple act of talking to strangers. We've covered so much ground today.
We have.
From the science behind deception to the impact of bias on our perceptions. And we've explored this inherent tension, I think. Between our desire for connection and the risks of interacting with the unknown.
It's a balancing act.
It really is.
For sure.
But even with those risks, I think we've also seen how rewarding these interactions can be.
They can be so rewarding.
They can challenge our assumptions. They can broaden our perspectives.
They can.
And they can even lead to these unexpected friendships and opportunities. So as we venture back out into the world, armed with all these new insights. What's like one piece of advice we can leave our listeners with?
I would say this: approach every stranger with a sense of curiosity and an open mind. Remember that everyone has a story and a perspective to share. And you never know how that story might enrich your own life.
Beautifully said. I think if we can all embrace
I think so too.
These unexpected encounters, we can maybe create a world where connection and understanding outweigh those feelings of suspicion and fear.
That would be amazing.
Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
A world where a simple hello could spark a meaningful conversation, a shared laugh, or even a lifelong friendship.
That's the dream.
It is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
Into the fascinating world of talking to strangers.
It's been a great conversation.
It has. Until next time, keep those conversations flowing.
Yes, keep them going.
And remember to embrace the power of connection.
Absolutely.
We'll see you on our next deep dive.
Looking forward to it.